Hey everybody, Relay here. Welcome to another segment of Flop or Not, where I simply decide if a game flops or if it doesn't. And today, the game of choice is The Division 2. Starting with the environment of the game. The game honestly isn't very variable, being that the entire setting is in the city. And so there's not really going to be like any elements of traveling abroad, going to like a jungle area or a cavern area, but it does good for what it has. You get to go underground a few times, in the sewers, in like some kind of bunkers sometimes, and so it does a good job at diversifying just the city aspect of maps. And to be honest, the fact that some parts are overgrown does show some attention to detail on Ubisoft's behalf. Now, while we'd all like to travel the globe, I'm sure, and go visit the Arctic and whatever else with missions and just side quests and stuff like that, again, it should be kept in mind that this is just the city, right? The main theme is set within Washington, D.C., and if you have the Warlords expansion, it will then be transferred over to New York. So it's limited to the city, but for what it is, to be honest, it's pretty damn good. The NPCs have constant, almost like constant activities you can join in. They're either transporting materials, or sometimes the enemy NPCs have like weapon transports or resource transports, which can be attacked and then taken from them. On top of this, the climate is always changing, so there'll be times where, of course, it's sunny, but at the same time, oftentimes out of nowhere, there'll be like a fog that rolls in, and you can't see more than like 5 feet in front of your character, and then it starts raining. So it's actually pretty immersive as far as the environment goes. I'm pretty impressed. So that's a hard pass for Ubisoft. They did a good job there. Moving on to graphics. Now, before I get into this part, I just want to note that graphics are not anywhere near essential to create a good game. For example, Minecraft and Terraria have both done spectacularly, and I thoroughly enjoyed them, even though they're pixel graphics. Of course, you can mod Minecraft, but that's besides the point. But I want to say that Ubisoft, they made this game rather stunning. Like, the game is how old now? Let me check. For a game that's 4 years old, it still holds up very well to the modern standards. Your character details look crisp, they look polished, they're not jagged or anything like that. Everything looks rather smooth and refined. The attention to detail in the buildings of the city and on the exterior of these buildings is actually quite nice as well. The reflections in the puddles on the ground when you're walking, things like that. Like, there's quite a bit of attention to detail that was paid to this game, and it really shows. So honestly, that is another hard pass for Ubisoft on this title. The graphics are quite nice, even right down to the cosmetics. As far as the story goes, I did find it to be a little lackluster, but no one really plays Division for the story anyways. Of course, the multiplayer co-op aspect is a big deal with a lot of people, and that's generally what they pick the game up for. But the story goes a little something like, post the events of Division 1, post the Green Poison, there are other rival gangs that show up, and in Washington this time, notably the Outlaws, the Hyenas, and the True Sons are trying to take territory and take over all of Washington, D.C. from the Division. And so you're left to clear out these factions and essentially retake Washington. Following the same narrative as game number 1, it's nothing groundbreaking, nothing revolutionary, quite generic, but you know what, it's the formula that worked for them last time, so I guess why not try it again this time. In that sense, it's also quite monotonous, and does kind of get a little stale, but it is what it is. Now, as far as performance goes, the game runs well when it wants to. Big emphasis on when it wants to. I swear they should have named this game The Division 2 Delta 3, because the amount of Delta 3 errors I've gotten mid-game where I just get disconnected is outstanding. I don't know if it's a server issue, but I know I'm not the only one who has it. The person I was playing co-op with as well has had it multiple times. And so it's just frustrating when you're trying to get immersed in a mission or you're moving forward, all of a sudden. And the torturous part is that it doesn't even happen immediately. You'll start to notice at first that you're shooting enemies, and the enemies don't register or take any damage, but somehow you're still connected to the game. You're still getting XP from the other player killing, so you're left to wonder whether you disconnected or the other one did. It's just a mess. It's a big mess, and the fact that they haven't fixed this, how many years? 4 years later is honestly beyond me. I don't quite understand it. Other than the relentless Delta 3 errors thrown my way, the only other things I've really noted with performance-wise were a couple of glitches where my character would somehow be locked after like mounting an object or trying to parkour over an object. I'd be hit with a collision, an invisible collision that I can't escape. And I found that to be a little frustrating. But all you really have to do is fast travel somewhere and then you'd be out of that collision. Into the battle mechanics. The battle mechanics are very RPG-like. You can cause status effects, you can build your gear towards critical hit damage and critical hit chance. And based on the gear that you're wearing, you can make yourself out to be a tank, a medic, or like a DPS main, or a mixture of all of them, to be honest. It's pretty fluid as far as how you can build your character. There are also active skills that you can pick, 2 of which you can use at once. So, for example, I'm using a shield, and I'm using what's called a hive, and there are sub-skills in these 2 active skills that you can kind of assign to that skill. For example, the hive can either heal, but I've got the revive hive on, so basically, revive hive. So basically, when I go down or when a teammate goes down, I can throw this little, it's like a ball, and it revives either me or the teammate. And on the other hand, I have a shield, which is kind of like the purpose of a ride shield. You take it out, it kind of covers your whole body, and then you can use your secondary firearm to still deal damage while tanking damage from other people. And eventually you end up developing kind of like a 3rd skill, but I'm not going to touch on that too much. That's just much later on in the game. And all this going to say the battle mechanics are fairly well done, and any combination of skills or gear can give you success in the game. Moving on to difficulty. The game itself generally isn't very hard, provided you have the right equipment. If you don't level your equipment or you don't continue to grab newer equipment, better level, higher level equipment, then you'll have probably a bit of a hard time. But the mobs are very easy, to be honest, especially with the skills provided. The game is not a challenge. The only challenge you might have is when you go into a dark zone, and sometimes on top of rogue agents, the enemies can swarm you pretty good in high numbers, and they're usually more elite mobs. And these elite mobs pretty much have their own skills as well. Sometimes they're a tank, they can be a sniper, a medic, a grenadier. It all depends on what you get. I'm pretty sure they're randomized for the most part. But that just means you have to adapt your strategy a little bit to deal with them a different way. For example, a tank's weakness is usually their back. So you can shoot their backpack and that breaks very quickly, and even though they're very elevated in the front, their back is now exposed where you can do a significant amount of damage and take them out very quickly. So you just have to play around the weaknesses of the elite mobs. So all in all, the difficulty of the game is pretty trivial, although there are some parts of the game and some areas of the game that may give you slightly more trouble than the other parts. The equipment in the game is divided into weapons and defensive gear, so like chest armor, helmet, knee pads, gloves, and multiple different varieties of guns, sniper rifles or marksman rifles, assault rifles, SMGs, shotguns, handguns. I may be missing a couple, but the bottom line is you play according to your playstyle. If you like to hang back a little bit, maybe grab a sniper. If you play aggressively, submachine gun, assault rifle, shotgun, etc. The common kind of RPG element comes into play where the rarities are taken into account. So the rarity scales from white or green, which are the least rare, to orange or red, being high-end or exotic, which are the rarest. Now, the thing that we've found, myself and the person I'm playing with, we found out that it's much better to just move on, even though you might have a higher rarity weapon, to move on to a higher level weapon, because the difference in 2 levels of weapons is astronomical. You could have a high-end weapon at level 30, and then at 32 you can get a green weapon that almost deals twice as much damage as your high-end. So until you max out your level, which is for the base version at level 30, and if you have the DLC level 40, then there's no point in really keeping an item just for its attributes, because it will be quickly outclassed and outdamaged by lesser rarity items. So as far as rarity goes, take it with a grain of salt until you reach your level cap, and then you can look into them, because then they do have some pretty good attributes. On top of rarity, equipment have brands that you can follow, and these brands, for each piece of that brand worn, has like an increase in critical hit damage or an increase in critical hit chance, and they have different attributes based on the brand that you're wearing. So oftentimes it'll be like an increase in assault rifle damage or an increase in marksman rifle damage. And that kind of you can play with to build around your playstyle and what guns you use. That being said, the equipment has a pretty key role in what kind of build you want to make for yourself, whether it's high damage, high defense, or a medic. Now you're probably wondering, how much does this game cost today, even though it's been out for 4 years? The price tag on this game is actually pretty agreeable. The regular price, at least in Canadian, is about $40 on the Uplay or Uconnect store. Now, at the time of this video being released, the current price is discounted at $12 Canadian, which is a really good deal. And at that price, I would certainly recommend grabbing it, especially if you have a friend to play with, or even a family member for that matter. On top of that, being that it is an old game, if you're not playing on the PC, I'm sure at your local GameStop or wherever else, you might find used copies for considerably cheap. With all this being said, the most important question of all, does it flop or does it not? Well, I can tell you for a fact, especially if you have a friend to play with, it can be rather enjoyable, or maybe even a family member. In that case, it does not flop. It's pretty far from it, although it's not necessarily a great game either. It follows the traditional Ubisoft formula, where there's not much puzzle behind to figure out what to do in the game. They pretty much indicate everything for you, every objective is highlighted, and so there's not much brain power involved in solving any kind of puzzles. But it is a pretty fun shooter, and is a enjoyable gaming experience to play co-op with a friend or a family member, as mentioned before. But it does get rather monotonous, especially towards the end. You're constantly completing the main activities, especially once you're out of main missions. You're just re-liberating outposts, and then the enemy takes it back, and then the same thing repeats itself over and over. So the replay value, even though it's a game that you can kind of go, as I call it, NG+, New Game Plus, is still kind of low. It's the same thing repeating itself over and over again, and the kind of routine of doing this multiple times over does kill the enjoyment of the game a little bit, especially considering it doesn't have much of a challenge. So I guess that's pretty well it. Take her easy.